Share my screen. Okay. So we're gonna actually, sorry, give me a second. Today we're focusing on important dates in Palestine's history. Obviously, we're not, can you all see my screen? I don't know why it's being very weird.
Yes, we can see it.
Now I can't see any of you. I don't know why it's doing that.
I think it's also showing that your screen is shared. Like on the bottom, you usually don't see that.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna stop and redo this. Now it's frozen.
Do you want me to share it?
Get out of this.
Huh?
Get out of sharing the screen. Okay.
It's not sharing now.
Okay, let me try it. Hold on. Sorry, guys. Give me a second. Good. We're getting more people in as we wait. Okay. There. Can you all see that? It's working. Okay. So today we're doing a deeper dive into Palestinian history. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover all of Palestine's history in our hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes, but we're going to get up until 1967, and we'll stop there and have a conversation, and then we'll continue history in the next week. I promise this isn't going to be like, or hopefully it's not a boring history lesson. I want this to be very interactive. So we're going to watch a video that kind of just gives us a nice quick overview of what's been happening. Then we're going to talk about a couple of key things. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the Nakba, and the Naksa. And then we're going to just end with some discussion questions and tying it into how a lot of these historical events actually explain what is happening today and are causes of a lot of what's happening today, and just have a discussion about how this history is important and why it's important for us to keep mentioning it and talking about it. So
Sabi, you have I think your screen is blocking where the video panel is.
Is that better?
It's a smaller square. There you go. That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So we'll watch this video first, and then we're gonna watch just a part of it, not all of it, up until 1967, and then I want to hear what you all already knew about the history and what was new from this video.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1970,
so we're gonna stop that video there. That's an overview of everything we're gonna talk about today. So it's okay if you didn't know all of those dates. I wanna just pause and see, you all can just unmute or put in the chat how much of this you already knew or did not know, because I think that'll help give us a sense of where we're coming in from. So are there like parts of Palestinian history that you already know, even if you don't know the exact names, but just like parts of it? What do you know about the history? And if you didn't know any, that's okay too. And you could also put that in the chat. I'm going to wait because I want this session to be a lot more conversational and discussion based than before. So
do you mind repeating the question?
yeah, so what did you already know about Palestinian history? Like any names or dates of in Palestine's history that you already know? And if you don't know any, that's fine too, and you could let us know that.
I mean, I personally knew that the Ottoman Empire fell, and that's what led to the British going into and dividing the Middle East in a sense. And then I knew that the War of 1948, the War of 1976, which were like Intifada Ula, Intifada Thaniya, and what happened with those. That's majority of the stuff I know.
That's great. That's a great amount. Okay. Thanks for starting us off. Anyone else? Okay, nice. Yasmin. 1917, 1948, 1967. Yasmin took Hope before, so this is an overlap, Yasmin, in this class. So if you actually you can help us through parts of the discussion since you've taken this specific PowerPoint before. Okay, and then thanks, Laura Halstad, not too much. That's good. So I think we're coming from different backgrounds of knowledge about Palestinian history. I think what I want to make sure we get out of today is the importance of holding on to this history, of continuing to talk about it, and just knowing these basics off the top of your head, because knowing this history is actually what helps us advocate for Palestine when having some of these conversations, because and we'll we'll talk about some of these myths, but there's a lot of myths that Israel uses to justify why it's taken over Palestine. And a lot of the main ones are that, if you've heard this line before, that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. So essentially what they're saying is Palestine was this empty space and with no people, and they were people that needed a home. So that's why they came in and took it over. But when we know this history that we're going to go over, we can prove like, no, this land was never empty. There were always people. They were Palestinians. They were diverse. And so that is completely false. This myth that it was just there and they came in. Some of the other myths that they'll use is that, you know, these wars were like of no choice, and they had to do all of this for self-defense. And when we go through this history, we can see that the people that were bringing the violence, that were bringing the oppression, were not Palestinians. It was Israeli Zionists, and Palestinians were just responding to protect their homes and who they are. So I'm going to take us through. And Becky, you started us off with thinking of the Ottoman Empire. So I want us to go back before 1948 and 1917, because usually that's when we start talking about Palestine's history. 1948 is the year of the Nakba, which I'm going to explain if you don't know. Usually that's where people will start talking about Palestine's history, but Palestine always existed before. Palestine was a country that, like other Arab countries, was under Ottoman rule and then became under British and French rule. So in this time period, 1800s up until 1916, the British and the French had a lot of control over most of the Arab countries in the Middle East. This map kind of shows you how, and literally, and so this it's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, was when Europeans, specifically French and British people in power, came together, looked at this area that was Ottoman Empire, where Arab people, Arab countries, I don't know if they called themselves that back then, but people that we know as Arab today lived, and drew these lines that created the borders of the countries that we know today. And I think that's really important, like how I think it really shows how artificial these borders are. These borders were forced on us, and these borders were created for the benefit of French and British for economic interests, really. So like, what resources are in this country that I want, what resources in this country that you can have. And they really just sat and split up the Arab world as we know it today in that way. So you could see the orange is the countries that became under French control or influence, and the green became under British control or influence. So Palestine, and unfortunately this map calls it Israel, but Palestine was under British control. And so these borders of like what became Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, all of that was constructed by them. And then Palestine got under British control. That's really important to know, because there was someone that empowered Zionists to come in and take Palestine, and that was the British. So when we talk about who's complicit in the occupation of Palestine, whether today or in the history, we have to also call out and think of British and European complicity in this. So this happened, Sykes-Picot Agreement. British have control over Palestine. 1917 comes, and there's a lot between that led up until 1917 that the video showed. So of course, World War II was happening. The Holocaust happened. There was a lot of guilt about what happened in the Holocaust and how other countries did not rally behind as they should have to protect Jewish people from something that was ethnic cleansing and was awful. Awful is not the right word, but I can't think of a better word right now, to protect them. And so we can think of it also as, you know, they felt this like guilt or this need to support them. But beyond that, also, they were going to get a lot of benefit from allowing Zionists to come into Palestine as the British were leaving, because that way they could have some type of influence and they could use Jewish people as well to support them if they needed it. So all of this is like very political. There's a lot of political and economic reasons behind it. It's very colonial too. Like, I think this proves how tied to European colonial history that Israel's inception is or was. And so in 1917, this declaration, this is very important because this letter really hands off and shows the support of the British to Zionist settlers to go in and take over what is, what they call Israel and what is Palestine. So you could read the letter, and I wanted to spend some time kind of unpacking and reading this this letter together. There's a couple of parts that are really important. It is addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was one of the Zionist leaders at the time. It says, "I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government, following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations." And so the aspirations being wanting to go in and take Palestine, or like live in Palestine. It says His Majesty's government, so they're talking about the British government, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. So really saying, we will do as best as we can to support you, to make sure you have the resources, the support you need to do this. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any country. I should be grateful if you bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So he's asking him to let everyone else know in the Zionist movement that they have the support of the British in going into Palestine. Are there any parts of this letter that stick out to any of you, that are like maybe a couple words or a sentence or two that you think are interesting?
I think where it says like it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, because like that's kind of exactly what happened when they like entered.
Yeah, like it says not to prejudice anyone else's rights, but they completely did not listen to that. So from the beginning, we can say like Israel has never really listened to what people have asked in international law and things like that, which it still doesn't. That same sentence that you pointed out, and this was something very newly pointed out to me that I think is really important. There is something else within that sentence. Although that sentence has good context or connotations, there's something in it that actually is a bit harmful to Palestinians. Can anyone figure out what it is? It's very difficult. Like I didn't get it until a year ago. So if you can't, it's okay. Does anyone want to guess? So we're talking about this right here. Clearly understood, nothing shall be done which may prejudice civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Okay. So what it is and what we want to be critical of is Palestinians are not mentioned here. Palestine is mentioned. Oh, did you bring that arrow? Wow. Can I move it? Cool. Okay, so we're right here. It's right here. Palestinians, like as literally the term Palestinians, are not mentioned. Palestine is mentioned, which is important. But what we're talking about is, why does it say non-Jewish communities, and why doesn't it say Palestinians in Palestine? So from the beginning, from 1917, Palestinians as a people that belong to this land were already starting to get erased, that they're only talked to or referenced as non-Jewish communities, not as Palestinian communities. How are you doing that while I'm sharing? That's really cool. So What?
You're annotating through Zoom.
Oh, I didn't even know you could do that. That's really cool. So I think that's a really important point and a very sad point, that a lot of times we read this and we're like, okay, so they weren't supposed to infringe on our rights, which is true. But I guess the reason that they can get away with it, and they have gotten away with it, is that Palestinians aren't even named. So the dehumanization of Palestinians as not being termed as who they are, but being termed as others, as non-Jewish people, starts from 1917, starts from way before even the Nakba. And I think that's a really important point, is that, and that's still happening, that still continues today. And this kind of helps us explain how and why it came to be. Any questions on that or other parts of this declaration that stand out to you or are interesting? Okay. So 1917, this declaration happens. It's kind of like the green light. And then we'll come back to this map. I want to focus on these two first, and then we'll get to the last two. So 1918, this is Palestine, right? All the blue is Palestine, Palestinians. And again, we're talking about Palestine as people of a country, not religion. So Palestinians included Palestinian Muslims, Christians, Jewish people, very diverse, all over the country. Between 1918, so right after the Balfour Declaration, and up until 1947, we start seeing more of the Black, and the Black is Zionist organizations and settlers starting to creep in, right? So we see a little bit here in 1918, and then by 1947, we're seeing more. And then something happens in 1948 that really shifts and transforms Palestine as we know it today, and how many Palestinians are allowed to stay in Palestine. So 1948, what happened is called the Nakba, which is an Arabic word for catastrophe, because it was one of the largest displacements and the first large displacement of Palestinians from their homes. And so we'll watch the video and then we'll give some more context. And if any of you have heard of the Nakba or know about the Nakba, I also want to know what you know about it and how you learned about it before.
70 years have passed since the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic, took place in Palestine in 1948, in which more than 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully displaced from their homes and pushed into refugee camps in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and neighboring countries. But the Nakba didn't end in 1948. The catastrophe continues to affect more than 12 million Palestinians, who remain stateless today. Historical Palestine was mostly made up of Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews, who generally lived together peacefully. The persecution of Jews across Europe led them to believe that they were not safe there, and Zionists saw Palestine as a prime location for a Jewish homeland.
And it was clear that there were Palestinians on the land. Zionist leaders and common people alike got used to the idea that the only way of making Palestine a Jewish state is by causing the Palestinians to leave.
The Jewish Zionist movement began organizing immigration and buying land in Palestine. This was the first step in turning Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Then World War I began. Britain promised Zionist support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. This came as a formal political letter known today as the Balfour Declaration. It also included that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. When World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire was defeated, Britain occupied Palestine.
Britain provided the muscle under which they could simply emigrate. I mean, they couldn't have immigrated were it not for the British presence, because the crucial battle in the early stages was simply getting Jews into Palestine and acquiring land. They couldn't have done that without British government's sponsorship.
Jewish migration into Palestine continued for decades, and the Palestinian people organized large demonstrations against this influx. Palestinians saw British support of Zionism as biased and unfair. So the people of Palestine revolted in 1936 to fight against British and Zionist occupation. During the 3-year uprising, thousands of Palestinians were killed, and hundreds of British citizens and Jewish Zionists died as well. Britain dismantled the Palestinian Revolution, leaving them with no political or military leadership. However, the British also began limiting Jewish migration. This upset the Jews who had fought with the British during the uprising and led them to create their own forces. Zionist militias carried out bombing attacks against both the British and the Palestinians. As things got out of hand, the British announced in 1947 that they'd be ending their mandate on Palestine. The file on Palestine was then transferred to the UN, which suggested dividing Palestine into an Arab and Jewish state. As the British were preparing to leave, the new Jewish population began taking over, and it helped that they were heavily armed. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians began months before the British officially left Palestine. Zionists were taking over major cities and hundreds of villages, forcing thousands of Palestinians into neighboring countries.
It happened many times that the Israeli, very holy soldiers took 10 of the youngsters in the middle of the village, shot them just in order to kill them, in order that all the others will see it and run away. And if it's not enough, they took others also.
The British ended their mandate on May 14, 1948, leaving their tanks and armored weapons to the newly created State of Israel. From the time the British occupied Palestine in 1917 to when they left in 1948, the number of Jews is estimated to have multiplied 10 times to 500,000. As Zionist Jews declared the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, the surrounding Arab nations declared war, with the objective of liberating Palestine. Although Palestine had the support of other Arab nations and they outnumbered the Jewish population, the Israelis also had foreign military, political, and financial support.
They were a highly prepared, highly dedicated, well-armed fighting force, which was superior to all the Arab armies combined.
Israel grew beyond the UN partition lines during the Arab-Israeli War by destroying Arab villages and further reducing the Palestinian population. By April 1949, more than 500 villages and 10 cities were captured by the Israelis. Over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, and over 13,000 Palestinians had been killed. Even then, the Nakba did not end. Today, Israel occupies the whole of historical Palestine. Israelis continue to build illegal settlements on occupied Palestinian territories. Palestinians in the West Bank live under military law, which subjects them to checkpoints, curfews, and arbitrary arrests. Palestinians in Gaza live under a blockade imposed by Israel. Gaza is set to become unlivable by 2020. Palestinians today continue to demand their right to return to their homes. For them, the Nakba will not end until this right is granted.
So I want to also clarify a couple of things because I realized I mixed some stuff up when talking about the Balfour Declaration. So I think it's important to remember the context of both world wars. So the Balfour Declaration was happening around World War I time. And that was when the British and French really strongly occupied the Middle East and parts of the Arab world. And that was when they were letting Jewish people know also that they can, through the Balfour Declaration, that they support Zionist, I guess they don't call it Zionist, but Jewish and Zionist settlements or coming into and having control of Palestine also. World War II happened in between that, leading up to the Nakba. So it was kind of like a final push, a final, that guilt that we were talking about before, we can say explains that final push to come in. But I think that context is important because a lot of times that myth that I brought up earlier of, well, Jewish people didn't have a home and were being prosecuted and need a home, and that was why they came in, can also be combated a little bit, because you can say, yes, that's partly true, but even before then, the idea of Zionism was around. And that is what ties it into it being a very colonial and nationalist ideology, like we talked about last week when we explained that it's not just about Jewish identity, and we actually want to separate that. It's not about Jewish people needing their safe space. It was partly because of that, but it being a concept of like European colonization also came before. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's important, especially with like the myths that Israelis use. Yeah, Donya, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't know if you saw my hand, but I just wanted to add one thing, which is, so basically the idea of Zionism was actually not even popular within the Jewish communities at first. And I think that's an important thing to note because it was a very far-fetched idea, and actually World War II and the Holocaust is what increased its popularity. So before then, it actually was like something like, I don't know, like it was a very minority part of the Jewish and even of the world that supported this idea, because they thought like, what is this? And it came as a result of a lot of anti-Semitic hate and hate crimes that were happening throughout Europe. So they were beginning to like say, oh, we need this, right? But it's not, and then of course, what Abid is saying, it's all part of a colonial project. But even in the beginning, there was no traction. So even the Jewish community were like, no, this is like a crazy idea. And it's not necessary, basically. But then after the Holocaust, it wasn't that it gained traction, but it became more of like the world began to sympathize in the sense that they were like, we didn't really say anything when the Holocaust was happening. Now it's a growing movement where people want to say something. So they, pushed towards, okay, let's just legitimize this. Maybe this will basically right our wrongs in the past, which it clearly didn't, and ended up oppressing other people. But just some extra context. Rashid Khayati does a really good job in a podcast that explains this. I thought it was very eye-opening when I heard it the first time.
Yeah, thanks, Donya. Any questions about it? Because I think that history is important. Again, when we're talking to people and we're hearing them use these justifications for Israel, this is what you can use to undo that. So any questions about it? Does it make sense, the like historical time frame of it? If it doesn't make sense, let us know also.
Well, I think backing off what Rami has said before, which is like the idea of Zionism wasn't even a thing when Jewish lived in Palestine. I think one of the times I was talking to my grandfather who lived in Safed, which is a port of Palestine, it's a city in there. And then he used to tell me that he used to go and play, like his friends were Jewish, and they used to go shopping together, and they used to go outside and play together, just like a regular community. So I just wanted to mention that. I thought it was interesting to me that like, okay, then how did these people like turn around and say like, well, Palestine is for us, and then you want to take it, and then it makes sense that after the Holocaust, everything just went down.
Yeah. I mean, even in when we're like the time, 1917 and Sykes-Picot, there were always Jewish people living in Palestine. And Palestine, again, it was diverse. There's Christian, Muslim, Jewish people. It's the idea of, like you said, one group of people taking over as a political entity through Zionism, not really through Judaism, is what was new in this time period and what is happening right now, like we're seeing in 1948 and continuing. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. So I want to make sure that when we're learning about these historical time periods, we're not forgetting the people that it affected and what it means to the families and generations that it has affected, because we also will hear a lot of internal criticism sometimes from Palestinians or Arabs or in general. Well, if Palestinians cared enough, they should have stayed, they should have fought harder. We forget like the real physical, emotional toll and hardship that something like the Nakba was, and also how unexpected, and no one knew that it was gonna be continuing 75 years later. This year is the 75th anniversary of it. So we wanna make sure we're putting a human element behind all of the history that we teach you. And this is a cool video that somewhat touches on that.
What people have to remember is this is in living memory. It's so deeply personal for people. Nakba or al-Nakba that in Arabic actually means the catastrophe. And the reason that it's referred to as a catastrophe is that about 80% of Palestinians who were living inside what became the borders of the state of Israel, what is now talked about inside the Green Line, were expelled from the country. That was about 750,000 Palestinians, maybe a little more. And around 500 or 600 villages were subsequently leveled. And they were leveled in such a way and deliberately so that Palestinians would not be able to return. I mean, think about it, 750,000 people about were forced out of their homes and never went back. I mean, who are it, right? Like, what does that mean, right? On a moment's notice, you're gone. That's it. You don't take anything with you, you take a bag. Like what you can fit in a bag, because you had to walk, you know, across the border to Lebanon if you were in the north, or to Jordan if you were in a different part, or Syria, right? People didn't think they were never going back. And, you know, people lost everything, right? People who had homes and, you know, businesses, they ended up refugees, like under the auspices of the UN. They lost everything, and people are still alive. And of course, we remember it because we grew up with their loss, right? It's much more of a street level grassroots movement. It's not a movement led by the political parties or militias, and it's spreading not just throughout the West Bank, but it's now spreading into Arab Palestinian cities and mixed, the term I can't stand, but that's what they're called, mixed Arab Jewish cities inside Israel, where that population itself is expressing extreme frustration as their citizenship, which has always been second class, comes to mean less and less and less. And I see here the possibility of what it means for young people to take to the streets again. You know, this isn't like a day where something happens and then there's a bad day or two and it goes away. It has the feeling of something that has more possible longevity. It's very easy for Americans to always sit back and say, oh, it's not our war, right? It is our war. And I say this now as an American, it is our war because we're paying for a lot of it, right? This will not end until an actual political solution is reached, and one that is just. In other words, you know, we can debate one state solution, two state solution, all you want. The one state solution, two state solution seems to be dead in the water. But whatever form the state takes, whether it's a single state or a federation of states, the issue is Palestinians have to have equal rights in the state.
So the one state, two state conversation is one we can get at later and not necessarily today. We can talk about when we're talking about more present day. But I think what's really important from this video is, like she said, it shows that the Nakba is not something that just happened and it was an event that took place in 1948 and it's over. And that's why we keep talking about it, and the importance of it in this class is that it was an event that happened and that continues to happen and continues to have effects, because Palestinians today are still continuing to be pushed out of their homes by Israeli settlers, and Palestinians continue to resist that. And that helps us explain. So we started at the beginning of a class or a conversation about when are Palestinians or Palestine or Israel talked about in the media and how, and it's usually that Palestinians are attacking Israelis and Israelis need to defend themselves. But if we can understand and articulate the Nakba as an ongoing thing, then we can understand Palestinian resistance as a response to the Nakba that never really ended and has continued. And that's why Palestinian resistance also needs to continue. So it's not just that nothing has been happening and all of a sudden Palestinians are resisting, it's that things, the Nakba and the effects of the Nakba continue to happen, and that's why they're continuing to resist. And the events that she was talking about earlier in this, they were talking about some of the grassroots movements. She was talking about 2021 and 2021 Unity Intifada, which we'll also learn about, which was a great kind of moment of Palestinian unity and resistance. So any questions about like the importance of talking about the Nakba, how the Nakba is understanding it as something that has continues to have effects and happens and not just something in the past. And this year is the 75th anniversary. So we should, obviously we always honor and talk about the Nakba, but especially this year, if you're interested in participating in like projects or certain stuff to honor the Nakba and you're close to PAC or want to help out, let me or Danya know, because we have some exciting projects coming up too. Okay, so I'm going to move us forward. We'll come back to have a lot of questions for you after these slides. So the last, point period that I want to make sure that we talk about is the 1967 Six-Day War, which is also called the Naksa. In Arabic means loss or defeat. I have to open this through the laptop directly because YouTube censorship.
You want me to send you the link?
Sorry, I'm gonna just pull it up. I used it. Say hi back. I promise nothing is inappropriate. They just said
فعلا أيها الإخوة الشعب العربي شعب واحد والجيش العربي جيش واحد ولن يفرق بيننا الاستعمار أو أعوان الاستعمار.
The 1967 Six-Day War is referred to by Arabs as the Naksa, the setback. It was a humiliating defeat for Arab powers and a major victory for Israel. It marked the beginning of 50 years of occupation of Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza and the Golan Heights in Syria, radically reshaping the destiny of the Middle East. On May 13, 1967, Soviet intelligence informed Egypt that Israeli forces were building up near the Syrian border. The following day, the symbol of Arab nationalism, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, ordered 130,000 Egyptian troops to move into the Sinai Peninsula along Israel's borders. The intent was to prevent an invasion of Syria rather than to attack Israel. As tensions escalated on May 16th, Nasser ordered the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces from Sinai. 6 days later, the Egyptian president closed the Tiran Straits, blocking ships from entering Israel's port of Eilat. Confident of their military superiority, Egyptian and Arabs celebrated Abdel Nasser's actions. What they didn't know was that Israel's army was better equipped and ready for war. In Israel, the media compared the Arabs to the Nazis, triggering memories of the Holocaust and fueling anti-Nasser sentiments. Fearing war, US President Lyndon Johnson warned both sides not to be the first to strike. The Egyptian-led Arab powers, fearing a US invasion, stood down. To their surprise, on June 5th at 7:45 a.m., the well-rehearsed Israeli aerial assault Operation Focus kicked off. By midday on June 5th, 200 Israeli jets had struck 18 Egyptian airfields, destroying more than 80% of the country's air force, before they even managed to get off the ground. However, Cairo made fake announcements claiming an Egyptian victory to rally its Arab neighbors to join the war effort. Syria, Jordan, and Iraq followed suit and started deploying their air forces to strike Israeli targets. But on the same day, Israel quickly destroyed all of their airfields as well, achieving complete air superiority. Despite not having any air support, the Egyptian soldiers held their defenses in Sinai against the Israeli incursion. Meanwhile, Jordan, under the leadership of King Hussein, had started a small offensive and had reached the hills overlooking southern Jerusalem. But by June 6th, Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir, having witnessed the might of Israel's air force, ordered the full retreat of Egypt's army from Sinai. Jordan, realizing the severity of Egypt's humiliating retreat, decided to pull back from its positions after minor clashes with the Israelis. By Wednesday, June 7th, Israel had successfully taken over the Jordanian-administered East Jerusalem and West Bank. By the fourth day of the war, Israel had reached the Suez Canal, with full control of the Egyptian-administered Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Having demolished the Jordanian and Egyptian armies, Syria was now on its own. On the fifth day of the war, Israel ascended the strategic Golan Heights. Syrian soldiers fought the Israeli forces. However, similar to their Egyptian allies, they were let down by the decisions of their leaders. Hafez al-Assad, then defense minister, accepted a UN ceasefire, undermining the ongoing military resistance. By the sixth day of the war, Israel accepted the UN ceasefire as well. But the damage had been done, and the Middle East would never be the same. Israel tripled in size. Arab armies and nationalism were crippled as a broken Egyptian president tried to resign in shame.
فإنني على استعداد لتحمل المسؤولية كلها ولقد اتخذت قراراً أريدكم جميعاً أن تساعدوني عليه. لقد قررت أن أتنحى تماماً ونهائياً عن أي منصب رسمي وأي دور سياسي وأن أعود إلى صفوف الجماهير وأدي واجبي معها كأي مواطن آخر.
Israel had proved its superiority and its army created a mythical aura, propelled by Arab leaders trying to hide their failures. Israel had gained administration of 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli settlements in the West Bank were built with more settlements in Egypt's Sinai and Syria's Golan Heights also under construction. Israel, taking advantage of Arab weakness, was not willing to give up its gains, using religious justification for their occupation of the lands. With its newfound power, Israel refused to comply with the international community. Palestinians had realized Arab powers could not protect them and went on to create their own national liberation movements that also failed to achieve their desired goal. Ultimately, the Six-Day War scarred the Arab psyche, paving the way for an overzealous Israeli leadership. And to this day, border issues remain unresolved.
So there's a couple of very important takeaways or points about the Naksa or the 67 war. I think to start, obviously, is the extra territory and borders that were created because of it, and the extra territory that Israel got access to or got to take after 1967. And so this is where we can come back to this image where this after the Nakba, and obviously there's a lot that happened between 48 and 67 that I would encourage you to try to research and read on your own, but just for like the context of this class, focusing on those 2 points. So this is what the 2017 one. So with these two between here, I think is showing like a lot of the effects of the extra borders that were taken in 67. You can see more of the blue being lessened and then more of the black popping up. So more Israeli control over parts that are at least supposed to be Palestine. Even the parts that are supposed to be Palestine, we see Israeli control and settlements being built there. And that's a lot of what's happening in the present day. And what's happening today, and what he said, border, in the end of the video, they say border issues remained. So a lot of what we saw in 2021 with what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and other parts of the West Bank or the occupied territories were results of what happened in 67 and Israel's confidence or I guess the audacity that they got more control of borders and areas in 1967. So now anything that existed or was there before shouldn't count, and that they should have full control of those areas too. And I actually want to show, probably show it because I think we have some time, a video that explains a little more about the present day impact. We have two videos show the present day impact of these borders. But I think the other really important part that we can understand from 67 is also, you know, that what he said, it scarred the Arab psyche. So any forms of, at least in my opinion, any forms of Arab nationalism or Arab unity were really gone in 1967 because of the loss. And a lot of countries just started kind of turning inwards and just caring about what would benefit them and what they need to do to, you know, enhance their own countries, and not really thinking of, okay, what other countries do we need to support and who do we need to be in solidarity with, which I think should have been the priority. So because of how powerful Israel was, because of its violence and its military use in the war, Arab countries like, you know what, I don't know if I can put my country through that, and to protect my borders and my land and not have them come in, I'm just gonna like wash my hands of this and just try to have peace for my country. And so, you know, we can think whatever we want, think about that. I think, but it is something to be critical of. I think, in my personal opinion, that Arab unity was just completely gone. And we can, you know, is it their fault? Is it not? Those are kind of conversations that we can have. But I think that was a key moment of Palestine kind of being left on its own, like they said in the video, and Palestinian resistance having to come mainly from on the ground in Palestine. So any questions, I guess, in terms of just 1967 and what it means, before we get into how does it affect present day, what we're seeing? Okay, so let's go. So we're gonna watch a couple more videos before, oh yeah, Donia, go ahead.
I just want to reiterate a specific point. So when we say the occupation, right, like the idea of the occupation, modern day occupation, we're specifically talking about the 1967 borders. So when you hear people say occupation, obviously all of Palestine is occupied, including the 1948 borders. But when you hear that, that's when you hear modern day occupation. It's because, like Abid was saying, that right now the West Bank, which is under Palestine, current Palestine, like the West Bank and Gaza, it's fully under Israeli control. So I just wanted to clarify that because I feel like sometimes people get confused. So just again to reiterate, 1967 resulted in the occupation, which right now when they refer to the occupied territories, they're referring to West Bank and Gaza.
Thanks, Sonia. And that can lead to other conversations about which borders do you go back to, and that's why, you know, the one state, two state, what are the borders of Palestine? I think if you ask, well, no, if you ask me, it's always all of Palestine in 1948, but 1967 is important to understand, to help us just understand present day reality of Palestine today. So to continue on humanizing these events, there's this, we'll just watch this video of people that were affected by the Nakba, and then we'll transition to how it explains what's going on today.
Lahwa Elayan is a Palestinian who lives in Beit Safafa, a town west of Jerusalem. She witnessed two wars, the one that followed the creation of Israel in 1948 and the Six-Day War in 1967.
There was the Jordanian army in Beit Safafa and Bethlehem. We had heard Israeli cannons attacking us, and they said the Israeli army controlled Bethlehem. When they said that, the people we sat with started running. While we were running, my father-in-law told me it is better to die in our home than to run away.
In 1948, Israel took over half of Beit Safafa, and in 1967, it captured the whole town.
This is one of the roads that divides Beit Safafa town into different parts. They were built after the war in 1967. Israel has also built the settlements around this town, just as it did elsewhere in the occupied territories. With these roads, Israel connects the settlements in Jerusalem to ones in the south, which are illegal under international law.
The war in 1967 changed everything. Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel brought more than 1 million Palestinians under its direct control in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And by the end of the war, Israel had expelled 300,000 Palestinians from their homes. Mustafa Osman is a Palestinian historian. He says Israel had clear advantages that were insurmountable.
I think there was a betrayal in this war. We didn't know about Israel's strength, but Israel knew about us more than we did. That's why they won. It was not only with weapons and other tools, but also with the propaganda and the Zionist lobby in the US. That's why we lost.
Since then, many Palestinians in the West Bank have been stateless. David Brin writes for the Jerusalem Post newspaper.
I don't foresee that changing in the near future. I mean, the Trump peace plan looks to be a non-starter from the beginning. The Palestinians refuse to even entertain it. I don't think Israel will be annexing any territory in the West Bank in the near future, despite probably support from the Trump administration.
The 1967 was a turning point for many Palestinians. It's been a long time since that war ended, but the suffering seems to only go on. Mustafa Fatih was TRT World, occupied East Jerusalem.
So that's kind of showed, again, these things didn't just happen and they ended, that they have very real consequences, effects on people that continue today. I want us to, before we get into like how this all plays out in the present day, to just pause and reflect on a couple of these questions. And just from everything that, from the last 3 weeks too of class, why telling history from the perspective of the people affected by it is important. So making sure we're hearing history from people who went through it, or families of people who went through it, from Palestinians themselves. What can we learn from this history? And how can it help us understand what's going on? So I know that third one might be difficult because we're gonna, if you don't know, we're gonna talk about it, but maybe focusing on the first two, why is telling this history important and what can we learn from it? I'm just gonna stop sharing for a second. So what do you all think? So I started off asking what history you know, and now going through some of this history, why do you all think this history is important or necessary? And what can you do with it?
I think it's like really important to know this information, because if somebody who wasn't like as or didn't know as much about the Palestinian conflict is on like the Israeli side, you can say you know the facts and you can like argue kind of against them.
Yeah, the history is fact, and if we're getting it from the perspective of Palestinians too, then we're able to tell the real history that's told. And I think part of it is that like this history is not going to be taught to you in textbooks, or like it's not going to be easily found. You're going to have to do a lot of your own work and research to understand and get this history. And so that, I think, shows how intentionally and deliberately the other side is trying to erase our history or trying to rewrite our history to fit their needs and their narrative. And why what we're trying to get for all of you out of this course is for you to have the real history, the real knowledge, so that you can combat that. Thanks. And anyone else have thoughts on why this is important? Have any of you like asked or talked to people who know about Palestinian history or who went through some of these moments and asked them what it was like? I mean, some people don't want to talk about it and don't want to relive that trauma in those moments, and that's very valid. But I think a lot of people, like family members, a lot of them are open and like when you ask them and want to keep passing down that knowledge. And that's a very like important part of Palestinian culture too, is that storytelling and passing down family knowledge. So I would encourage you to go and ask your families what they know about the Nakba or the Naksa, and did you have any family members who went through it or lived through it? What was it like for your family? Do you have any ties to these historical moments? I think you'll learn a lot of cool stuff about your family if you do that. Another kind of concept or thing to think of, and what history helps us do is it helps us figure out the difference between the Palestinian narrative and the Zionist narratives. And really the Palestinian narrative, now if we can understand this history, it shows that it's built on the idea of being native to the land. So that word that we learned last week, being indigenous to the land. And it includes collective, so community experiences, knowledge passed down from generations of Palestinians. And it takes into account that these events, again, are continuous and they are very disruptive, but they shape Palestinian history, identity, faith, culture, and economy as we know them today. So again, especially when talking about Palestine, I would argue all of history, but especially Palestinian history, they're not just things that happened and ended, that we continue to see them manifest and they continue to shape what it means to be Palestinian today. So we'll I actually want to watch the other one first, and then if we have time, we'll come to this video. So there's a video that centers around a lot of what happened in the summer of 2021. If any of you followed on social media, again, with Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, there's a lot of protests. Mona al-Kurd and Muhammad al-Kurd were really that's when they blew up on social media. We're doing interviews. If you all remember, there was the video of that guy named Jacob who is from a Jewish person from New York and is telling Mona al-Kurd, if I don't take your house, someone else will. So there is this moment of intense Zionist settler confidence to go into Palestinian areas of East Jerusalem, which again, if you remember, the 67 border was a result of the 67 war. Going in and saying, this is my home, I can take it, it's not yours. And so those are very closely related to the effects of 67 border. And this video, we'll watch just the first couple seconds of it. First couple minutes of it does a really good job in explaining that and showing it from Mona al-Kurd's perspective also. I'm going to, if it decides to work, I'm going to skip just the beginning part because it is a little graphic. Although I don't know what is too much for age anymore.
Did you know that there's a simple combination of natural ingredients that will help you poop out pounds of old rotten waste in your colon within just a matter of...
Well, on the ground.
Johnson, why are you naked? Because my t-shirt sucks. Look at Gibson. He's wearing a true classic tee.
Well, on the grounds of Al-Aqsa, it's one of the holiest places in the Islamic religion. And so we've come here today on one of the holiest nights of Ramadan. The crowds are huge. So if anything happens, it could potentially be very dangerous for the people that are here.
It's nighttime prayers for Palestinian Muslims. And this year, Israeli forces showed up unannounced.
I'm just going to skip parts. Parts that I'm skipping are just a lot of violence that happened against Palestinian Muslims who wanted to practice and wanted to be in Al-Aqsa, and that became a site of Israeli violence on Palestinians.
Jewish Temple Mount, but most of East Jerusalem is important to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. It's also the site of the sacred Jewish Temple Mount, but most of the people who live in this part of the city are Palestinians. That's been slowly changing since Israel captured the area in 1967 and started moving in settlers. Jewish people now make up around 40% of the population. And in 2018, Israel was emboldened by President Trump, who moved the US embassy into East Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. It outraged Palestinians, but was celebrated by right-wing Israelis.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
At the heart of the fight over East Jerusalem is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, home mostly to Palestinian families, some who came here in 1956 after being displaced by Israel when the state was created 8 years earlier. Israel claims Jews historically owned this land. Now, there's a lawsuit to forcibly evict some Palestinian residents, making its way through the courts. Protesters have been turning up since the issue reached the Supreme Court this year.
بسنة 67 أول بيت استولت عليه الجماعات الصهيونية بعد الحرب ب5 أشهر، شهر 11 67 استولوا على أول بيت بالحي وهو بيت عائلة الشنطي.
Mona al-Kurd and her relatives are one of 28 families fighting in court to keep their homes.
صدقوني ما حد من أهل الحارة رح يطلع إلا لآخر لحظة يجوا يشحطونا شحط، بدنا نعيش بيتنا أرضنا.
Other Palestinians have already been replaced by right-wing Israeli settlers.
Hey! Hey! جيبوا رجاء بدناش.
من ايش صار هسه؟ ايش صار؟
كانوا واقفين شباب وصبايا فلسطينيين وهجم عليهم، نزلهم بالعصاي. شوف العصاي اللي بايده، سرقين، هذول سرقين حراميه. انا وياهم بنفس البيت.
هم ببيتك؟
هم ببيتي. تعي شوفي. هذا البيت اللي اخذته ستي لانها لاجئه تهجرت بال48 من حيفا. هذا البيت بابا بناه بسنه 2000 لانه تزوج وجابنا فصار بده مساحه اكبر، بس بابا انهى بناء البيت وعمرنا ما سكناه. اجى القاضي سكر باب البيت ورجع على المحكمه وامر انه البيت يضله مسكر بحجه انه مبني بدون ترخيص.
منو يعيش بيها؟
مستوطن، شباب مش عيله.
انتوا تعيشون هنا
وهم هون
وهم يعيشون
بالضبط
هنا.
بابا وماما كانوا يشتغلوا، حوشوا مصاري وبنوا هذا البيت.
اوكي،
كله من تعبنا وشقانا. وبعدين اصدرت محكمه الاحتلال قرار بانه يجوز للمستوطنين السكن في المنزل. طب ما هذا البيت بدون ترخيص صح، وعليه امرين هدم. طب هو بدون ترخيص، على اي اساس بتسكنوا مستوطن اسرائيلي فيه وبتمنعوني انا كفلسطينيه اسكن فيه؟ على اي اساس؟ اني ديمقراطيه هاي؟
ايش تشعرين لما تشوفي؟
قهر، انزعاج، يعني مزعج متعب. أنا ما ببكي لأني ضعيفة أبداً، صدقيني والله، بس ببكي لأنه نتعاملش مع دولة عادلة، احتلال، وهذه أرضنا. أنا انخلقت، ربيت، وعيت، كبرت هون، على أساس في يجي حدا ياخدها؟ كيف؟ بأي منطق؟ اللي عم بيصير مناهض للقوانين الدولية. تهجير القسري جريمة حرب.
I'm going to stop sharing there. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to just really open it up to discussion and conversation. What did you all think about that video specifically with Mona al-Kurd talking, and just in general, how a lot of these events still play out today in history? And it could just be feelings, thoughts, comments, doesn't have to be anything profound.
Like, I could really feel her frustration just watching that. Like, I can't imagine someone just coming inside my home and just like telling me to like leave, especially after like her father like, you know, built it and everything. Was that correct? I don't know.
Yeah, her father expanded it for them, and then a part of it is they're told that part of it is not for them. They're not allowed to have because it doesn't have a permit. And again, that permit that they're talking about, that Israel gets control of that area, can control or ask for a permit, is because of 1967.
Yeah, and I also found it interesting that she was like, what kind of democracy is this? And she's so right, because like they're saying, oh, Israel's like the best democracy in the Middle East and all that, but it's not true at all.
Yeah, that's another one of their myths, right? That this history helps us undo, is that they claim to be the only democracy in the Middle East and they're the only ones that give people rights and that's why they need it. But yeah, we can clearly see that that's not true. And I want to put Sada put in the chat and made her tear up, which is same. I think every time I watch it, I get pretty emotional. Their thoughts or reflections on this video or any of like what we've talked about today in general? Was any of this new for you all? Did you know this already? Yeah, you can also write in the chat. You can also let us know if you did not enjoy this, and that's okay too. Not everyone enjoys history. Yeah, maybe if we can end going around or just putting in the chat one new thing that you learned today, and we can end from there. Hopefully you at least learned one new thing. Was it too hard to follow a lot of this, or was it just? Okay. Nice, thanks, Ben. So you knew a little about Nakba, but not the Naksa. And I don't want to say that one is more important than the other. I think, but usually people at least know the word Nakba, but not the Naksa. So it's important to learn both. Ghazi thinks you learn more of the details of 67, which is good. I think yeah, so much of what's happening in the West Bank right now is because of 67 and 48, because of all of it, right? Yasmin, I know you did this before, so if this was kind of repetition, that's okay. But Musa or Saleh or Sada, any new thing you guys learned today? If a lot of this wasn't new, I think tell us that, because that's going to help us know how to structure the rest of the course. So we can also take this as just a moment for you all to tell us what you want to learn more of. Same Sada. So not new, but made her remember why she hates Israel. That's valid. Musa learned about 67. Okay. That's good. I know this isn't always the most fun parts of learning about Palestine, and then Saleh said learn more about the past history of 67. But they are important because, again, all of it is connected. All of it has continued, especially for Palestine, and continues to affect and create the reality of Palestine today. So I think we'll end there. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you guys